Good morning. Welcome to the Safe Communities Committee meeting, October 13th. We will get started with introductions, and then the majority of today's meeting will consist of an overview of all of the recommendations and different components of our Safe Charlotte initiative, as well as feedback from our community input group today. We've got a couple of folks who will be presenting from their discussion last week in that group. So we appreciate their being with us today. And we will start with introductions to my left in the room, and then committee members online, any other council members joining us online, community input group members, and staff.
Federico Rios, Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration.
Johnny Jennings, Chief of Police.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Chair.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
James Mitchell, Vice Chair.
Marie Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Other committee members?
Dimple Ashburn, member.
Victoria Wellington, District 3.
Renee Johnson, District 4, committee member.
I don't believe we have any other council members with us. Community input group members? Ladies first.
Vicki Foster, Retired Assistant Chief of Police.
Cindy Decker.
Mr. Mims?
Mims,
AKA No Leasy.
aka No Limit Larry.
I'm the only one that knows your government name. And
Not
staff,
that Miss Vicky too.
staff members? Okay, well, I guess they are with us in spirit. I see their boxes on the WebEx, but they might not be right by their computers. Mr. Jones, if you will lead us off with an overview of our agenda for today.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. Today, it's really feedback that we'll get from the committee. But what I'll do is just show us where we are right now in terms of our timeline. I'll turn it over to Federico, who will orchestrate or conduct the discussions that we received from the community input group, and then we'll flip it back to me for a close it out for the next steps. And Mr. Chair, if that's fine with you, I'd like to go to a quick presentation.
Let's do it.
Okay, so thank you. So where we are right now, and I think Marie is pulling that up, is I really want to start with the community input group, and I'll just let the members of the community input group know that I think you already know this, but you're a bunch of rock stars, and already we're getting calls from Arizona trying to figure out how you did what you did so quickly. So we really appreciate your input. And as we work on this living, breathing document that will hopefully be approved by council at the end of this month, we lead in with just having that community input group. So where we are right now is that on the 5th of October, recommendations were provided to the council at the strategy session. There was a community input group meeting on Thursday, and Federico will walk you through that. Last night, we presented again to the city council to make sure that we were on the right pathway, and we have the nod there. So we're here today. Our goal is to have a report issued on Friday the 23rd, and I will tell you that report will continue, keep the document together, but after the public comment period and the council action on the 26th, we'd like to make sure that it's a high quality product that's based on what we gather from the 26th. So that's where we are right now in the process, and I would like to turn it over to Federico to give us an update of where the community input group has been based on our point in time today.
Before Mr. Rios starts, I would like to also acknowledge that Councilmember Winston has joined us. Good morning, Mr. Winston.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here.
Mr. Rios.
Well, good morning again, Mr. Manager, members of the committee, and all those present from the Community Input Group. We were tasked by the City Council to reconvene the CIG, and they all that could made themselves present for our meeting on Thursday that the manager already alluded to. I just wanted to share again publicly, first, thanks to Mr. Manager for this opportunity to lead this group. This has been an amazing effort put forward by community members that are, if nothing else, incredibly passionate and committed to our community. And so grateful to have been a part of this work. I will share out the input that has been rendered by this group, and then based on a couple of different items, and then I will begin the feedback. We've invited three of our community group members to offer some feedback on the recommendations and on the process that was undertaken that they were a part of that now you shared other municipalities are considering looking at. So I will offer their feedback and then read a letter from a committee member that is not present, but definitely wanted his sentiment shared, and that is Pastor Peter Weary with Mayfield Church. So we asked a couple of questions. We asked first around input related to Mr. Manager's presentation to council on last Monday. And so I'll go over the items that were shared. Rodney McGill shared that he was very heartened. He felt that there were good things, that the proposals and recommendations in the presentation were thorough. He stated that 5 years from now, we must make sure we didn't just provide recommendations. Things can't look the same. He also stated that we can't wait for another shooting or another riot. We have an opportunity to set a standard, and that the city manager has offered money, but we need a process to track, otherwise we're just throwing money. Robert Dawkins shared that there is a violence dashboard that's being created to track violence. The Office of Violence Prevention will track programs of the city and county. Public will be able to see it, and reports will be provided weekly. And county is in the process of hiring a full-time manager for this office. We went into the violence dashboard a bit. That violence dashboard lives on my office's website, so anyone that's listening and is interested in viewing that can do so by looking up the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration. Also, it was stated that the Office of Violence Prevention has been created, and the dashboard is present. Corinne Mack shared that even with the work the county is doing right now, there has to be a level of accountability. Our leadership chooses people they are comfortable with, not so much people who are going to best serve the communities who are disenfranchised. She had hope in this group would have some input or an opportunity to weigh in on any person that is chosen. And actually, to my knowledge, and this is separate from us, this is something that's occurring through the Office of, through Public Health with the county. One of the community input groups is actually on that panel in review. Reverend Christy Snow shared that when they talked about the $1 million in allocation, they discussed this money possibly going to nonprofits and for-profits, and that they are open to input. It's important to be clear what type of input we would like to give around that. Cindy Decker, who's on the call, offered up the question, is there a way for people from this group to connect with the county and the city ongoing around the work that both entities are doing, and how do we keep all the information in one place where everyone can access it? Also, Tanya Jameson said that she was heartened by the work. She felt that it was good work, that more than anything, she's curious to see how council acts upon the recommendations that have been presented. And Kaz Otley closed this out on that piece around being excited about the recommendations and really wants to put into motion how those things will be monitored, will it be short or long term, and wanting to see the fruit of its work and what it looks like. I will go into now, we spent some time talking about what went well and what didn't. I think overall the statements that were made were that the process was a strong process, that we were able to engage each other through the breakout groups, and that our challenges were technology. We had a number of times where the internet just wasn't working for everybody, and that proved challenging, and we didn't have the opportunity to have that one-on-one discussion and piece that everyone would have liked to have, but given the circumstances, we still made it out well. And then another point of question that arose was, how do we continue interacting with this group? What would they like? How would they like to be interacted with? And So the statements were shared that email is the best way to stay in touch, getting periodic updates from my office as well as the Safe Community Committee. There was a question as to whether or not they can tie into intergovernmental relations at all, given some of the legislative items that arose. Shared that quarterly updates would be great, and that that would offer them a feeling of the work being ongoing and a continual feedback loop. Also, there was just some questions about how do we do an even better process going forward. So can we offer up more opportunities for the group to share out amongst themselves? And we had a tight schedule, so we didn't always get the opportunity to do that, and I shared as much. But overall, the group members shared that their experiences were good experiences, and they want to ensure that they are a part of the process going forward, that what they have presented and worked on, they were heartened by the work that was offered up by Mr. Manager, and the council now has the opportunity to vote on. Everyone amended Tanya's sentiment that they're really curious to see what of those recommendations will move forward. So I will now share a letter written by Pastor Peter Weary in regards to his experience. Dear Mayor Lyles and honorable members of the Safe Communities Committee, thank you for the opportunity to serve for these past several weeks on the Community Input Group subgroup of Council's Safe Communities Committee. I consider it a great honor to have worked with such brilliant and dedicated city staff and CIG colleagues. I'm aware of and grateful for the enlightened approach our city has taken towards the reimagining of policing in Charlotte. I'm most impressed with the understanding among our city council manager and chief of police that doing such work involves much more than simply moving money around and firing some people. I have listened attentively to the open session of council from October 5th, and as a citizen of Charlotte, I'm proud of the plan articulated in the manager's PowerPoint. What follows is my request as a member of Breakout Group 4 that you not foreclose on some items which I heard were not going to make it into the initial plan to be voted on during the council session on October 26th. Most police are dedicated public servants, and so I want Charlotte's professionals to be the most respected and competitively compensated in America. I do concur with Mr. Driggs' observation that it is important to communicate to police officers a sense of our appreciation and value for them. But my reason for concurring must be seen through the lens of a black man of a certain age who has experienced here in Charlotte mistreatment by an officer in CMPD. More importantly, I concur with Mr. Driggs because, as he is probably already aware, there's an inverse correlation between the level and sense of appreciation felt by officers and their propensity to engage in excessive violence in performance of their duties. I believe Mr. Bakari's ideas about Charlotte becoming a police employer of choice were innovative and powerful. I fully support such improvements. I only ask that we consider these necessary things, I only ask that as we consider these necessary things, the focus also remain on the wonderful and comprehensive presentation by Mr. Jones. The problems of policing in America, and especially in Charlotte, are not one-dimensional. I further ask that this process, as positive as it has already been, not be tainted by a false equivalence which elevates incentives for police to the same level of urgency as the pain of black people and others of color, which has occasioned the angst and aggression in our streets. I will confess that my own psychic pain and sense of righteous anger nearly dissuaded me from accepting the opportunity of service on the CIG. The closely consecutive murders of Harold Easter, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd drove me, and is now cleared the rest of the country into a very dire place. As a practical theologian, I have nonetheless learned over the years to pay close attention to the zeitgeist. The blood of these 4 black citizens and others cried out to me from the ground that there may be no more fruitful time than now in our city, and hopefully in our country, to creatively and aggressively pursue substantive and operational change in the way black life is treated. One cannot force anyone to value black life, but one can certainly better manage the feral, malign, and ignorant impulses of violence against black life by some people in power in our country, including the broader culture of policing in America. You, our city council, manager, and chief have clearly demonstrated that you are serious about these aims of equity and peace. I am proud of the work you have already done. All my work on the CIG and on Breakout Group 4 has been focused on these same aims, because hopefully our recommendations are all fairly clear as written. I will strategically highlight only a few. We encourage council to give full-throated endorsement to Breakout Group's 4 recommendations, requiring all future CMPD recruits live within the city of Charlotte or Mecklenburg County. As in any city, Charlotte has its own very distinct community history and culture, differentiating it from bedroom communities all around us. Officers living immersed in Charlotte's unique culture will have fewer opportunities to succumb to suburban bias, which at times may be class-based as well as cultural, aka racial. These same officers will also approach their duties each day with a more concrete stake in the community they serve. As many incentives are as feasible should be extended. This seal for dismantling primal systemic violence against black and brown people, as well as those allied with them, will account for some recommendations made in Breakout Group 4's work, which may on their face seem infeasible. Example, attaching money damages from civil lawsuits or even firing actions to officer pensions at the end of our document on passive protests and peaceful demonstrations. We heard the city attorney report that pensions may not be attached. Noted. The point, however, is that for too long there have been no meaningful sanctions personally levied against officers who mistreat and murder people. The time for finding a monetary sanction has come. Jesus made it clear that where one's treasure is, there will be their heart also. We urge you to go further than we could, and qualified immunity notwithstanding, craft some mechanism whereby offending officers who are bad actors are held more personally accountable than they have or ever will be under the current regime of law. I'm sure you all are painfully aware that the optics of officers involved in the death of Harold Easter, for example, being allowed to resign rather than face any judicial action for allowing a human being to die are horrible. Although Mr. Merriweather, due to the facts of the case, saw no pathway toward building a successful prosecution in a day like this, other factors should be considered. The point is the decision to terminate the officers in the district attorney's stated conclusion, citing an abject failure of operating procedure and general standards of custodial care, should at least have been grounds for some financial sanction personally against officers cited for termination or even administrative sanction in-house in such cases. Our discussion concluded that such officers may display more careful regard for life, even black life, if they are certain to face some financial liability, since no legal liability is likely in their near future. We concluded that the time has come for the entire posture and purpose of CMPD protests to evolve. In addition to abandoning use of chemical agents, etc. By the way, we still advocate discontinuing pepper spray. Keeping pepper spray and discontinuing tear gas to a person on the receiving end is a distinction without a difference. Our conclusion is that the reason for police presence at protests should be to ensure that the constitutionally guaranteed right of protest is protected, especially from outside forces intent on creating disruption and violence. We even went so far as to envision officers also riding or walking along protesters instead of menacing them with SWAT-clad officers or bicycle lines obstructing movement. We have been gratified to see some movement towards this in recent street actions, and by the way, the new uniforms are exciting. Our work makes allowances for dealing with the unlawful behavior by select individuals, so we hope that these recommendations are useful. Somewhat new features of this strategy are mandating that every protest organizer provide their own clearly marked observers, and that as a matter of course, the ordinance be revised to require protests take place in the street as a backstop against damage to the public or private property. Our discussions revealed a consensus that in areas where interagency cooperation is required to implement a suggestion of the CIG, at least a public affirmation of the sense of council should be declared. Example, qualified immunity, or reiterated. Example, subpoena power for the CRB. We advocate collaborating with state legislatures and the DA to amend the rules of criminal procedure, providing an exemption for legitimately qualified felons for probation mandates, which require the admission of guilt. This practice exacerbates the already disparate impacts of incarcerating black people. These declarations by council also ought to be followed by persistent, methodical action to eventually effectuate the change endorsed. It was exciting to see the council, the manager, and the chief in agreement on an expanded role for the CPCRT. Group 4 also discussed, as did Mayor Pro Tem Eisel, the advantage of CAHOOTS, having its own readily recognizable, and I will add non-5.0 looking vehicles as possibly a good model for our newly reimagined CPCRT. Finally, Group 4 has done our best to be collaborative, open-minded, direct, and honest brokers in this process. We have articulated as best we could our concern that the changes you will make in the wake of our work will not be tinkering around their edges or rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but will be substantive, thoroughgoing realignments of resources, public policy, and power. For this reason, we are supportive of most changes recommended from other breakout groups, particularly those which were discussed plenarily. I personally am greatly encouraged by the work council, the manager, and the chief of police have already done to this end. Thank you all for this privilege of serving our phenomenal community. Respectfully, Reverend Dr. Peter M. With that stated, I do not expect any of the other three individuals to, one, use vocabulary as high as Pastor Weary has, nor to offer up a 3-page letter, but we would love to hear from those individuals who have joined us on today's call And as a matter of respect, I will ask the ladies first, and we'll start with retired Deputy Chief Vicki Foster to share regarding how the process was undertaken and her feelings around the recommendations. Ms. Foster?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I will say that I do have some feedback in reference to the process. Wasn't prepared to give my feelings on the recommendations because we talked about it was just feedback on the process, but I can do that as well. I'll be very brief. The positives are I think there was a good cross-section of people involved in this process, and I think that you and Tanya did an excellent job at keeping everybody on track the best you could, considering we were going in a lot of different directions. I also think it shows a good faith effort to the community, really, by the city council to have this. And I think it's pretty innovative, as I don't recall this particular type of evaluation and feedback actually ever happening on the various works of CMPD. So I do want to commend council for actually putting this committee together. And I also want to commend Victoria Wallington, Councilman Wallington, because I do feel like when you have committees like this, that it's important to have representation of everyone. And I know that there were people on the committee that didn't feel like police should be on the committee, but I will tell you that it's like talking about a medical diagnosis and not having a medical doctor at the table. So I appreciate that opportunity. I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. And many of us didn't have the exact same views, but because we wanted the same outcomes, our respect for each other and our respect for each other's opinion allowed us to get through the work and to come up with recommendations. The negatives, I will say, obviously, I mean, we all said this in the very beginning, it was very quick. And we understand that. We understand you're trying to get something done in a certain amount of time, but it was a very quick process for people to try to look at a lot of information. And so I would just ask in the future that, you know, we plan it a little better. And as was stated, we did have some computer challenges, and being in person would absolutely help us, because once we broke off into groups, we were not as familiar with the other recommendations from the other groups. Obviously, we could read them once they were sent, but we didn't know the conversation or the feelings behind them and where they came. And so for me, that was a challenge, because I understand where the recommendation was coming from and what the conversations were. I think that it probably would have been incumbent upon us to let some of the presenters know exactly what was needed, and I'll in particularly speak to CMPD on that part, because I think that some of those things could have been anticipated, because when we have to go back and forth to continue to ask questions that probably should have been able to be answered in the first presentation, you know, certain things like demographics and, you know, if it's working, how is it working, and what is the success stories. And I think that we should have provided more to them as to what we wanted to help with our time and not having to go back and forth and ask some very basic questions. And let's see. The other thing is, I do think that sometimes there are state law and there's HIPAA and there's certain things that we cannot do certain things. And because there isn't necessarily somebody in that particular group or room that can explain that, we sometimes make recommendations that are not exactly feasible. Doesn't mean it can't be looked at, but they're not feasible. And so I have some examples of that, but I'm going to wrap up because I realize that everyone else has some things that they like to say. But overall, I will say it was a good process. I do think that there's some things we can do better in the future. I do hope that we will look at this as the opportunity to not penalize police, and I'm not anti-community pro-police or pro-police and anti-community. I just think that we always have to remember that there's money everywhere, and that it should be a thorough look throughout all of the agencies to take a look at that, and it's not a punitive thing. So that's my piece on it, and I would love to get into the recommendations, but I wasn't prepared to speak on that today.
Thank you, Ms. Foster. We will continue on with Cindy Decker. Cindy?
Good morning. Thank you so much for allowing this community input group to have a voice at the table with all of you. I think it is a game changer going forward. I kind of walked into this at the beginning of the year. I had already been working on a program with Chief Kruputny, the Bridge the Difference, and the Ambassador Program, which was really designed to help get community members involved, to educate them, to train them, to be sort of a host group of people, to be part of the ground force when the RNC was to come. And at the beginning of the year, we heard of the strategy session where the mayor announced that there was going to be a new strategy in dealing with violence, and that would be to name it a public health issue. And so that, to me, was another game changer by bringing in the different resources from the county and to look at it from a totally different way. And there was some amazingly good work that was done with the data and the research that we were presented of all the factors that lead to violence and the violent crime in the city. And one thing that was very clear was a recognition that using the police as the sole agency to address the complexity of this problem had taken a real toll, not only on officers, but on the community. And I just thought it was, this is a brilliant way to engage all of the forces and resources to go at this problem, and by inviting the community to come in and say, hey, we need the community groups to be involved in helping us. I thought we were going to go after this thing and have great success right from the beginning of the year. And then, of course, we had the COVID that happened and kind of shut things down, and that began to add a lot of tension in the community as well. And it was like, wow, what could be worse? And then we had the death of George Floyd. It was worse. So that created basically this group. It led up to this coming together and bringing this back really to what was priority at the beginning of the year. So I think this puts us back on track, going where we needed to go. And to me, it felt like this was kind of a triage to address this with how we did it so quickly from the mistakes that were made on June 2nd. And it was good to, there's always these silver linings, but to me, I felt like it was thinking inside the box, because we were given information to review as it was. There wasn't a whole lot of time where we could think outside the box. And I'm looking forward to more opportunities with that. And a lot of that did happen. But I loved the process. I congratulate Federico there were just a ton of paperwork and information and things to read over. And he just plowed right through it and said, come on, we're going to do this. We can do this. I thought the diversity was the best thing of all, because you really did have all the perspectives at the table, and it was well appreciated. It was a little short, but it really turned out to be something that built something substantial in the community for future input and sharing of ideas that I think would be really important. What I would like to say about what I didn't love so much was just the fact that we came at this as more of an audit to kind of cut back and trim away and edit down some of the things that we were looking at in law enforcement. It almost felt like a little bit of, we're punishing them, and I know there was a lot said to reaffirm that that's not what we were after. We want to work with them. We don't want to, it's not what we want to do to them. But we didn't spend enough time on enhancing what we have, building a better model, identifying what is working, and then expanding that and strengthening that. And I hope that's where the focus goes. The experts that were brought in, there was at least 3 of them I felt were kind of, they were biased in the sense that at their agenda, at the end of it, you could find that they were about abolishing the police. So that, to me, I thought was a little bit unproductive because we had already decided that's not what we're doing. But they were able to make their presentations, and I think that law enforcement didn't really get to bring vision and a presentation in that way. They basically had to answer what they were being questioned about. So I think that could have been an improvement in the representation, and I think Vicki just alluded to more of that. So I would like to just give a couple of comments on how I reimagine policing. And one of the things I think is paramount is to consider, we're not going to do away with law enforcement. It's our best tool that we have that we can use. So people should be open to really thinking how we can increase the funds and the resources to make law enforcement the best thing that we can offer as a city to keep us safe, but also to be more involved in the community level. So I would reimagine policing to be a well-trained force, and the training could be upgraded to where it is accredited, to where it is college level training that could work towards degrees. I mean, why waste a lot of the time and the training to just enhance the job to where it could be something that will follow that officer in their future and in their career. I think we have an opportunity to train them in skills of psychological, I'll call it the psychological arts or psychological warfare, but officers should be trained in the ability to engage with a human being that's inside maybe the crime committing body, but able to apply intuitive skills to redirect, to lead, to disarm, any situation. That takes real training and real focus. And I think that's something that we should be investing in. I think that we should expose officers to situational relevant environments that are the norm or close to the norm of the communities that police, like an immersion. I spent time in the third world, and there is a difference when you're immersed in the world of the people that you're trying to communicate with. And I know we're talking about having them live in these areas where they police, but I think there's more training that needs to be done on the reality of thinking and identifying with the individuals. What's it like to be in a household where you don't have two parents, or there's always drugs and alcohol, or there's always aggressive behavior, and there's fear and mistrust, and we have to identify with the people we want to help better. And I think that all can be done through training. I loved what Chief Jennings said at the beginning of the year, or of his transition into being the chief that he wanted to invest more in the health of his officers. That is so, so important, that they are whole people if they're going to help the broken people, where there's much more investment in their own personal health and well-being, to make them some of the best people in our community. I can imagine policing being more focused, going after the CEOs of the crime bosses that are capturing our young people, rather than just spending most of the time dealing with the outcomes of those lives. Getting to the root causes of these things in our community. And we need our police officers to be the best that our city can offer, who are rewarded monetarily, that it becomes a career that is highly esteemed as a life path, and that it becomes something that people in the community, young people, high school students, are introduced to this career early on, and it's something that they look to as a career that would be a real benefit and something they would desire for their life. So there's a way to reimagine policing to become something way more amazing and important in our community. I appreciate this opportunity to have these conversations. It was funny, on the last day that we talked, Robert Dawkins revealed that a lot of people were telling him that, you and Cindy are going to get into it often, so you need to be ready. And he said, well, actually, Cindy's the first person I'm going to buy a drink for when we're done with it. So I appreciate the relationships that were built, but I'm looking forward to more opportunity to brainstorm and create and collaborate amongst the group that was brought together, and may it increase in all these different areas. So thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Federico and the staff were amazing, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Decker. We'll move on to Mr. Mims as our final speaker.
I just want to echo the sentiments of Ms. Vicky Foster when she said that, number one, thank y'all for putting this, just having the wherewithal to put this committee together. I think it was a very diverse committee when you talk about, not even just talk about the ethnic background, but also talk about, the walk of life that each individual come from. I'm a radio personality, but I'm also a citizen of Charlotte, born and raised in the city. So I'm a original Charlottean, which is very few and far between here now in the city of Charlotte. So to see something like this come about was really big for me. To see the CMPD along with the city and the county put this together was big. I thought the program, I thought the committees were very good. I really don't have any negatives because I'm a person that focuses a lot on positive energy. So the positive thing about it for me was the fact that we were all able to sit down. And in the beginning, it was kind of chaotic because everybody was trying to push their own agenda. Everybody was trying to get their own point across. But I thought, what became brilliant about the whole process is when we did the breakout groups and we were able to start to accomplish getting the things accomplished that we needed to get accomplished. So I think that was brilliant. I'm looking forward to see what happens next because I think we have come up with some wonderful ideas. But the idea is only as good as the next step. So I think I'm looking for the next step, and I want to see what happens. As far as any recommendations that I have, I just want to see the police come out more in the community and be more. And I know we hear this word over and over again. We hear the word transparent. But the part I want to be transparent about is information, because a lot of the programs we talked about that the police had, a lot of people in the community just didn't know about. So I would like to see get involved a lot with social media as far as Facebook, Instagram, because that's where a lot of the youth are. A lot of them have Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter. So I think the CMPD, city and county need to get behind an initiative to put that together because you'll reach more youth that way. And I just look forward to seeing what's next. So I'll just leave it right there.
Thank you, Mr. Mims. I don't know if there's any questions to be had for the members of the community input group.
Mr. Mims' point about promoting all of what's going on, if only we had an ally with the most popular morning radio show in Charlotte that could help us spread the word, I'm sure we could get it out there.
Yeah, most definitely. So, I'm definitely available to do that. I just need the information, and I can definitely put it out there because, I'm a servant of the people.
People listen to you that won't listen to us, so we got to have voices in the community that.
Well, just give me the information and any information that needs to be disseminated out to the public, and I will get it out there.
I know. I kid because I love. I've got a question. I know we've got a couple of questions. I've got a question for Ms. Foster because I've heard a couple of anecdotal responses to this, and I suppose yours might be anecdotal as well, but as someone who came up through our department and now probably feels more able to speak freely, when we talk about the incentives, and it was touched on, I believe, in Pastor Weary's letter, and council has discussed it, the incentives or additional incentives to try to entice our officers to live in the areas that they serve, be that just anywhere in Charlotte or maybe even specifically in the divisions that they serve in specifically. I have heard a couple of anecdotal things, positive and negative, around that, and I'm curious as to your feelings or conversations you might have had with other officers as to whether those incentives work and what the pros and cons of those are. And I think we've got somebody, I'm looking to see if I can figure out who. We're getting some feedback, so if everybody can make sure they're on mute, I'll do the same. And Ms. Foster, I'd appreciate your insight on that specific potential action by council.
I have two sides to that, and I think that people don't remember or don't really think about. One of the reasons, as I've said before, that officers don't live in the city of Charlotte is primarily due to taxes, especially from the younger officers that are making $50,000 and $55,000 a year, and they have a family to take care of. They tend to choose where they can save money, and that's typically in the county. You do have a lot of officers that are not as positive about Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. Just as anyone else, people pick where they live based upon schools and upon school districts. And so that's another reason. When we talk about specifically having people to live in areas that they police, I think people tend to forget, and while it's great, it's a great idea. I think that wanting to connect people and have people have ownership is great, but you also have to remember when people live in a community, then they are not off ever. And I can give you just from personal experience of back in the day when they used to give us discounts at apartments and your kind of apartment security, and people would knock on my door at 2, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning because you become their personal police. And so that is one thing that you forget, because police have to be off just like everybody else has to be off. Then there's also a safety measure of, I work in a district where I lock up Mr. Jim, and then Mr. Jim's kids and family and everybody else is upset. Now there becomes the retaliation of what happens now. They're going to do something to my car. I have to worry about the safety of my family. And I think that when we talk about these things, we only talk about it from one side, and we don't look at both sides of why these things don't occur. And, I tell people all the time, look at yourself and say, would you want to live there? And so I think you have to be fair. I understand the purpose, and I think that there are some people that will want to do it, but I do not think that you will get the response that I think that the committee or the council is expecting. I do not think that you'll get, 100 people that want to live in the city of Charlotte for an extra whatever it is, 2,500, whatever it may be. So that is my personal opinion, because I think there are so many things that are left out. And when I talk to officers and people, those are the things that are left out. So again, I just wanted to say, please look at both sides of a situation.
I appreciate that feedback, and I think every council member can probably attest to the fact that it can be tough to never be able to be off. And when you walk into the grocery store and somebody wants to corner you about something, and you're just trying to buy, something to make dinner, that's not always ideal. But I will say it certainly does allow us to be more connected with the community that we serve too. So I think there are two sides to it. Chief Jennings, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on some of it. I do want to say that I actually lived some of the things that Assistant Chief Foster was talking about. You know, working, doing drug work in my earlier years, and running into people that you really shouldn't be running into on your time off. And also, I think one thing that people forget is that a lot of times these officers are not the breadwinners of their household. So if I have a spouse who makes significantly much more money than I do, and that spouse needs to live in Concord or another county or something, then how do you say that you have to live in Charlotte because you're a police officer? So it's very difficult. I do agree with incentives, that we throw incentives, whether it's vehicles, moving expenses, things like that. And like Chief Foster said, that would allow the officer themselves to make that decision on whether they want to live within the city or not.
Yeah, there wouldn't seem to be much opportunity cost in offering the incentive. I think Ms. Foster's got a valid point that we might not get the adoption of that incentive or that enticement that we hope to. And for me, I guess it begs the question, and if you don't have an answer off the top of your head, either Chief Jennings, Deputy Chief Foster, what is the best way then? I think one of the big things that council wants to achieve with that, and I think you said there's certainly a lot of validity to it, though there's another side to the argument. How do we, if not through residency, how do we ensure that the officers that serve our community better know our community? I think we do, and I think as council members, we all see when we go out to community meetings, community events, the engagement, particularly of certain officers who are charged with being the community liaisons and things like that. The engagement of our officers in our community is really strong, and I think most community leaders know a handful of officers really well. But how do we better acquaint all rank and file with the community that they serve? Because if they don't live here and they're only ever encountering the citizens that they're charged with serving in an encounter that is in their role as a police officer, how do you build that trust and how do you build that rapport? And that's, I don't have an answer for that.
So I'll just speak real quickly, and I'll let Chief Jennings answer that. I think that you have to go back to the basics of policing. I mean, obviously our footprint is much larger now today than it has ever been. But that door-to-door, making connection with people, we require people to do, certain things. You can require people to, knock on doors. You can require people to do those things. However, you have to also keep everything within reason, because the time that these officers have right now, because one, they're short. So it's very hard to have that extra time to make those connections, but there is a way to make it happen, but you have to be able to have the time. And so you can also say, my expectation is that the people in your response area, and however Chief Jennings determines that is to be done, you can hold people accountable. There's ways to find out, have you gotten out? Have you knocked on some doors? Have you met some new people? Have you been to some new events in that community? And there's ways to do it, but we have to be creative, and we also have to remember that time is always a factor, especially for 160, 70 people.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't have said it better. And you have to set those expectations out, whether it's in performance evaluations and things that the expectation all the way from the sergeant to what they expect of the officers. But we do have some ways of even keeping track of that now, where officers are able to enter some of the things that they've done, whether it's I went out for an hour and walked in the Beatties Ford Road corridors, things like that. So they're documenting those things. But as Chief Foster alluded to, that every time that an officer gets out of their car and walks a beat, when they're answering call to call, that we take them out of service to be able to answer those calls. So for too long, we've kind of had the assigned people to be the community engagement people, the officers that are assigned to do that, and they do a very good job of that. It's more difficult to do that with your radio response officers, because now I'm taking them off the line. And as you know, with the shortage that we have, a lot of times the entire shift is just answering calls for service. So we're trying to come up with ways to better do that, and officers to check out to be able to do it. And again, like Chief Foster mentioned, it's a matter of expectations that you put down to the officers.
I'll just say, I mean, my hope, I think, in figuring out which calls that currently land in CMPD's lap can be diverted to other specialists. To me, one of the best outcomes of that would be freeing up more time for those sort of interactions that can build trust and build relationships. That's a long play as it relates to finding a solution for the challenges that we face, but I think it's an important one. So I've got Ms. Watlington followed by Ms. Ajmera.
Okay. I'll be brief as possible. I've got several questions, particularly from the Reverend Doctor's letter. First, let me just say, and we said it last week, but I just want to reiterate, I'm super proud of the group and the work that CIG has done and staff. And if I hadn't already said it, Federico, you are amazing. You've done a great job with this, and I look forward to what else we can do. So with some of the things in Dr. Weir's letter, I love how he's articulated, and I think that there are several points here that are worth exploration. So I did just want to ask a couple questions about some of the things that he mentioned in regards to what we're talking about now as far as the recruits living in the city. And as it relates to any requirements, are there legal barriers to require someone to live here as a condition of employment? I don't know if the city attorney is around or.
So the short answer to your question is yes. There are some legal requirements or issues. There are some constitutional issues in terms of putting together a residency requirement. Based on the things that I'm hearing, I'm not overly concerned about the discussion the way that it's going. I have always recommended that you focus more on incentivizing the residency as opposed to requiring it, because it does come with some potential constitutional strings depending on what that requirement actually looks like, and oftentimes it is treating certain employees a certain way that you don't have for other employees. For instance, the rest of your workforce is not under a residency requirement, but the police department is. It's easier with more singular executives, say for instance the city manager or the city attorney, to be able to do that, because there's really, given our jobs, they're very different and distinct from what everybody else does. So that's the short answer is there are some constitutional restraints, and as we have this conversation, again, it is my recommendation that you focus more on incentivizing it, getting sort of voluntary compliance. But if you get to the stage where you want to talk about a mandatory residency requirement, we can certainly engage at that stage.
Okay, thank you for that. Just wanted to understand the landscape there. And then the next question, Dr. Leary talks about officers who are bad actors are held more personally accountable than they have or ever will be under the current regime of law. When it comes to creating financial liability for officers that have not had any legal liability assigned, what, if anything, could be done in that vein, given that there is an appeals process and that if they haven't been assigned any legal liability, what mechanism would we even be able to go down the road of financial liability?
Is that question for someone in particular or anyone who wants to field it?
The attorney?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, I just want to understand, what can the city of Charlotte do to hold an officer financially liable for something that they have not been legally held liable for? Hello? Did I get disconnected?
We can hear you, Ms. Watlington. Can you not hear Mr. Baker?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear him now.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm still not now in live. I'm muting myself. So you have policy and state law that prevents the city from basically paying or defending an officer for egregious things that are so far outside of the color of law that you wouldn't actually defend the officer, nor would you pay the officer's judgment. When it's something so personal to the officer that it's not in the course and scope of their work with the city, but it is a situation, and I'm thinking of times in the past where an officer in another, my other employer, who engaged in basically a vendetta against an individual while he was in his police uniform, but it was clearly not anything related to the legitimate pursuit of law enforcement activities. It was a personal vendetta, and he just decided to assault an individual while he was on duty, but it had nothing to do with law enforcement. And at that point in time, there is state statute that would prevent us, if we came to that conclusion that that had nothing to do with their employment. There is state statute and city policy that would prevent you from actually defending the lawsuit and would be a defense toward paying any judgment against that lawsuit. So there are certain areas that you do have that ability. It's a little more challenging if you're now talking about I hate to even say it, sort of the run-of-the-mill, the normal excessive force case where it's clear that the officer is acting under color of law, but it's determined that they've exceeded their authority to use the force necessary in that case. It's a little more challenging then to decide that you're not going to pay that particular judgment. But there is flexibility when you've made that determination that they've exceeded their authority and it's outside the legitimate legal bounds of their work with the city.
Okay, and then as a carryover from that discussion, this point about being allowed to resign rather than face judicial action, can you give a little bit of context for what governs that process?
So,
because obviously there are some community.
So at this stage, with the civil service provisions that you have in your employment for your firefighters and your police officers, essentially the chief can only recommend termination, and ultimately, they have the ability to appeal to the civil service, and that's something that's embedded in your rules and regulations that you have going forward. So there's not a situation where, they can ultimately make the determination that they're not going to appeal, and that's typically when they resign before you've had the clarity to actually terminate them. And I don't know, Chief, I'm not, since I'm a little new to Charlotte, I'm assuming that that's how it works, and that's how some people get to resign before you've actually terminated them, because it's your recommendation for termination and not an actual, you're gone situation. Am I correct in that?
Yes, absolutely, you're correct. And officers, like you said, they have the option to appeal if I cite someone for termination, or even if I give someone time off, they can appeal to civil service. And then at that point, that's when the civil service makes the determination of what the corrective action or uphold the termination of that officer.
And there is still a box, even if they do decide to resign, and even in a situation where you even haven't actually recommended a termination, once they've separated, there is actually a box that I think still exists as to whether or not you would rehire that individual, and you certainly have the flexibility to say no, even in a situation where they've resigned prior to either receiving the recommendation for termination or even getting to the stage where you started an investigation. They can see the writing on the wall, choose to resign, but you still have that ability to check that box that goes, I think, to the state, the certification board, that you wouldn't rehire them. Is that?
We have that ability to check that box on any type of separation from an officer, whether they resign or whether regardless of why they're leaving, we usually will check that box. And I think there's also a misconception that these officers are all getting other jobs as police officers somewhere. So when we cite someone for termination and they resign, that information stays in their personnel file. So another agency doing their due diligence and hiring would now ask for their personnel file from CMPD, and all of that information would be in there. If we were to do that with another agency and ask another agency for someone's personnel file, they would have to release that to us, sign a waiver. If they don't do it, we don't hire them. If they do sign a waiver, we get their personnel file and it has that information in it, we won't hire them. So it's not as easy as I'm going to resign and then go work somewhere else.
Okay. I'd like to, just as a follow-up, I'd like us to, or I'd like you all, Chief and Mr. Attorney, to bring back that information. I just want to make sure that everybody's eyes is on and that we understand exactly how that process works. It sounds like you've got an overall grasp of it, Mr. Attorney, but I just want to make sure that we understand it letter for letter. The next thing is I just wanted to say that in regards to requiring protests to take place in the street as a backstop against damage, I would support that. I do know, because of some conversation that we've had previously, that there are some statutory implications there. But I would like to understand what it would take, Mr. Attorney, to be able to put something like this in place. So if we could do a preliminary investigation there. I would support a formal resolution in regards to some of the interagency suggestions, particularly subpoena power for the CRB. Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if we need to vote to send that forward or if we'll include that as part of the recommendations, but I would support a formal resolution to that end. And that's everything that I've got on this particular piece. And many thanks to the Reverend Doctor for putting the pen to paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watlington. And I think the strongest way that we can signal, for instance, the subpoena power is inclusion on our legislative agenda. And I believe I mentioned at the last committee meeting, but if I didn't, I'll reiterate that we have received a letter from Chief Jennings formally stating his support for that. I believe the Citizens Review Board will be taking up whether they want to formally endorse that as well. And then it's my expectation that as a full council, or at least a majority of the full council, will support that being on our legislative agenda. And I do think that it is important to signal things like that we support, even if the entire decision is maybe not in our hands. One thing just as a footnote to a point Ms. Watlington made about Pastor Weary's letter, the protesting confined to the streets, I certainly see the pros of that. I would want to make sure we discuss the cons of that too, which could potentially be, is it another thing that could lead to law enforcement and protester conflict if we're asking law enforcement to enforce that protesters stay in the confined area of the street. So I'd hate for something that is intended to minimize potential damage done during protests to lead to encounters with law enforcement that sort of undermines the purpose of our doing that. So, but I do think that's
just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that we do that. I just want to understand what the legal framework is around it.
Understood. And I've got Ms. Ashmere next, but I see Ms. Decker's hand up. I didn't know, Ms. Decker, if you were wanting to address something specifically from Ms. Watlington's questions, or I think I saw you shake your head, so
Yeah, no, I was just going to go back to what your question about how do we build that relational bridge within the community if they're not going to be living in the community, but I can wait on that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ashmere?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also like to echo my colleagues' appreciation for the Community Input Committee and for the work that you have done. We certainly recognize the time and effort you have put into this, and this was all voluntary, so we certainly are very grateful. It was great to see the diversity of our community input group, and I do have some questions. I know Ms. Decker had brought this up, where Chief Jennings had said that invest in the health of our officers. So is there a specific initiative, Chief, you have in mind, or a program that you think we could implement to look at investing in the health of our officers?
Yes, that's a good question. So, yes, there are some certain limitations that I have as far as when I talk about the mental health of the officers that I can't force them to get psychological evaluations every year or things like that. But there are things that I can do internally with group sessions, with facilitators who can openly have these smaller groups with officers that can come in and speak freely, and then also provide resources that are available within not only within our department, but things that they can get professionally, and how to identify when they are dealing with emotional distress and things that they need to take a step back and decompress. So we're going to be putting some of this stuff in place early next year. We're in the process of creating that right now. But I think that's important because a lot of times officers will hold things in, or when they they need to seek that help, we're releasing that stigma of that I need some help to help me cope through the day. So we're going to be putting some stuff forward next year, and that's just the beginning of it. There will be some other things that I'm looking at as well to hope to put into place within the next year or two.
So thank you, Chief Jennings. I think that's certainly a good investment into the health of our officers. Mental health issue has often come up when I have talked to officers, and really we need to invest in the health of our officers. Having served as a police cadet many years ago, I have worked with officers who were going through emotional challenges, but were not willing to share with anyone or willing to talk to an expert. So I think if we can have that really investment in the culture where it's okay to speak up, or where it's okay to really talk to someone, and especially an expert, to get help, I think it will take us a long way in retaining our officers and also getting them help when it's needed. So we got to invest in that culture. Other than that, I think my other questions around residency were already addressed by Mr. Eggleston and Ms. Watlington. So that's all I have, but really great work to the staff, Mr. Manager, and also our chief for being open to listen to the other side and really implement the changes that we need to reform our police department, but at the same time investing into our police officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ajmera. Ms. Johnson?
Yes, thank you. I also want to echo my colleagues in thanking the CIG. I heard words when they were describing their experience like brilliant and innovative. So this is very exciting to witness and to be a part of this collaboration. So thank you. Thank the speakers, and also Dr. Weary for the eloquent and excellent letter, and for his commitment in District 4 and to this group. I do want to ask a question about residency. Is there something that we can do from a city-county perspective in reducing taxes for any recruits who live in the city? That's one of the things that Chief Foster mentioned. Is that something that we could provide as an incentive for officers who live in the city?
I'm not aware of any tax abatement policy that you have for individuals. Again, my recommendation would be focus on incentives. So if there was a residency pay or something like that, and increase some sort of incentive like that, as opposed to anything that's called tax abatement, I think that's going to be a challenge.
Similar to an aging in place program where we can't change the taxes of the person, but we can help offset them.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I know there's not a current policy, but you're saying that it would be a challenge for council to create a policy?
I would call it something else. I just wouldn't, it shouldn't be a tax abatement, but you can incentivize by providing, some monetary benefit that the officer could have in exchange for them living in the city limits. You can certainly do something like that. I would just avoid talking about tax abatement.
The net effect would be the same.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Winston.
Yes, I just wanted to chime in. I do think, especially city council members, are able to look at this topic of residency from both sides. As Mr. Eggleston pointed out, we get held responsible for a lot of decisions, both pro and con that are made in this city and the effects that it has on people. We get threats. We get there is no. I'm always your city council member, regardless of how this job is defined and what other work that I'm doing, and people treat you like this. I think we need to go hard in putting incentives on police officers, law enforcement officers living in the communities that they work in. I think it should be, in fact, that an incentive, much more than punitive measures. But I think those incentives should be stark. For instance, the take-home vehicles program. You should not be able to park a take-home vehicle outside of the city of Charlotte. And we have ways to enforce that. For instance, we spent money on data collection on our vehicles over this, I think, the past fiscal year. So as we look to do this, it should be a defined difference, a very clear difference on what the take-home is for being a law enforcement officer that lives within the division or at least within the city that they serve. And if there's ever a body that can understand both sides of this, it is your duly elected city council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Mr. Jones?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the incentives for law enforcement officers to live in the city, I don't want to get out over my skis, but we have been working with Pam Weidman. I want to make sure that what we're doing is legal. I totally agree with the city attorney in terms of incentives. Right now, the incentives are $2,500 one time or a take-home vehicle, and I'm not sure that gets people excited if, that's a tipping point. So we're looking at...
To reiterate that, you said the $2,500 is one time, it's not annual.
Or it's over a short period of time. It's not, I know we do it one time, it may be twice.
It's not a recurring.
Two phases, right. So what we're doing is looking at a minimum down-home assistance payment program, as well as an assistance to rehab. We think that those are some incentives that are much more than that, but that's just the beginning. What I've talked to Ms. Whiteman about is that anything that we have that's already in our toolbox, I want more, but I want to make sure that I can treat employees differently. So we will come up with something that is an incentive that you've never seen before, that's bigger than, if we can, than you've seen before, but we are taking the incentive route.
Thank you. Ms. Decker, that seems like perfect timing. You said you wanted to offer some feedback on the residency discussion.
Yes, thank you. There is a group in the Freedom Division that I've worked with, and they are such a great example of the partnership that would really help move this relational connection with officers and the communities that they serve. They are called the Freedom Division Advisory Group, and they are like your neighborhood group that came together, and they partner with the officers. They know who their officers are. They host event. And another thing that they're going to start doing that we're talking about is making sure that every one of these amazing programs that CMPD does with the youth, especially, I would say their number one is PAL. But then some of these other resources for officers and the community to connect are going to be vital. And I think your community groups are key to helping officers get to know their communities better if they can't live in those communities. They have business leaders that are part of this group, and they assess the needs of the community and have this open communication and dialogue with the officers. I mean, that probably is the best model for having that healthy relationship within the community, but that should be increased. It's a great model. They're the Freedom Division Advisory
Council.
And they have a website and everything, but it's something really great to think about.
Thank you, Ms. Decker. Would you mind sending some additional information on the things that they've been doing to Mr. Rios so you could share it with the committee and the council?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Rios, do you want to put a bow on your section of the agenda?
I just wanted to do something I have yet to do, and that's thank my co-facilitators. Donata Jackson is here. She stepped in and was clutch for me. Thank you so much, Donata. Lacey Williams, Cherry Grant, Emily Yaffe, and Melina Price, who without I would not be able to keep my head on my shoulders. So just thank you to those co-facilitators for helping us with this work. It is truly appreciated. And again, thank you, Mr. Manager, for entrusting this work to me.
Mr. Rios.
That sounded like a squad.
What's that, Ms. Watlington?
I said that sounded like a squad. I hear that some of the names that you said, and those are some of our best folks. So
That's the A team.
Yes, exactly right.
Well, this is the second heavy lift I've gotten to undertake with Mr. Rios, and there's no better man for the job, and there was no better team to help get us across not the finish line, because we're not done, but to close out this first half or whatever it is, to try to pick up on my colleagues' terrible uses of analogies in all of our meetings. We'll go with first half. Or Mr. Graham talking about switching the gasoline in the car. That's his favorite. With that, Mr. Jones, I think we are to the point where you can lay out the next steps for us.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee. I'm not going to let everybody give out thank yous without me giving out some too. So I really appreciate this committee and this council trusting the team to do the research to bring it back. I just really believe that there's going to be many cities across the country that are going to attempt to replicate this model of the community input group. So one of the things we've learned very, very early on is government can't do it by itself. So it's very important to engage with the community. So we call ourselves Team Charlotte. With 8,000 folks, I feel like Team Charlotte is closer to 900,000 folks as we're starting to go through this. So one thing I do want to do is again thank you, Federico. You're the right person for the job, and thank you, Chief, the way that you listened. You're willing to come back in. There are a few people behind the scenes I think is very important. We had a lot of arguments over the weekends trying to get data and information to you. So Marie Harris, thank you so much for putting up with me, and Ryan Bergman, the budget director, and the policy team pulling together information. And the person that you really don't see much is Julia Martin, who is the assistant to the city manager, who also has been working very hard. And I don't think she knows this, but she's now on to the second half, and the second half is implementation. So our goal is to get this passed on the 26th. We're making some assumptions that much of this will be passed, so we're starting already in that implementation phase. It's going to be a lot of tough work, but we're pulling together a team that solely is going to work on this over the course of the next 60 days. So we don't want to be in a situation where we have all of this energy and everybody's together, and then we get to January and someone's asked, well, what happened? So that's really what's next. We won't wait until the 26th to begin some of the paperwork that has to get through in terms of getting consultants on board, as well as initiatives that we can do that would help us move forward in terms of having additional resources. As you may recall, as we were on the October 5th extended strategy session, and the budget director showed how we have a few $1 million that are available to us now based on the way that we've been able to handle the CMPD budget. So things like expanding some of our responses. We're not going to wait until July. If we get that nod on the 26th, we're going to begin to move forward with that. So just want you to know there's a lot of energy. We didn't look at this as a task that ends on the 26th, but it's the beginning, and we will continue to work as hard as we move forward as we have the last 90 days. So I'm very appreciative for all the support of Team Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Ms. Watlington, you wanted to add a comment?
Yes, I did. I noticed that while we've been here, that we received a letter from Ryan McGill, the chair of the Civil Service Board, and I just wanted to lift this up as I know that we're moving on to next steps. I want to make sure that this did not go unaddressed. And he noted here that on October 6th, the Civil Service Board, during their regular monthly meeting, considered a proposal offered by Robert Dawkins with Safe Coalition North Carolina to amend sections of the city charter applicable to the Civil Service Board to give the Civil Service Board the ability to consider and investigate cases sustained by the Citizens Review Board. After detailed discussion, the Civil Service Board voted 5-3 in favor of the recommendation and to request that City Council take the steps necessary to further pursue this course of action. I'm not sure where this in particular has landed, but if without delaying some of the implementation work, I don't want this one to go without at least the full investigation as to what it would take to meet the intent without infringing upon our officers' rights to have an appeal.
Thank you, Ms. Watlington. Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Councilmember Watlington, we discussed this last night, so the direction from the council was this requires a legal review, and so this is a part of the legal review right now.
Awesome. Thank you.
Ms. Ajmera?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Manager had briefly touched on the budget, where we'll be start working on it right away. I just want to make sure the health program that Chief had talked about for our officers, especially mental health, that does reflect in our budget. So I just want to make sure that's in your radar, Mr. Manager.
Thank you.
So one note as we move forward, starting with our next meeting, which you'll see on the agenda, November 10th, we will be shifting back to a noon time slot. So for our committee members and staff, just make sure you make that adjustment in your calendars as we move forward. We will be going back to our normal monthly meeting schedule and our normal noon time for that. And before we close out, take a quick point of personal privilege. You can see my vice chair handsomely modeling a stylish mask today, a vote yes for the city bonds, and I'm rocking my sticker. He didn't even remember what he was wearing. He's looking at me trying to figure out why I was calling him handsome. And I'm wearing a sticker to the same effect, and I cannot nor will I speak for the city of Charlotte in this, but will speak only for myself. As we look at addressing community safety, I hope that our citizens will really take a long look at these city bonds that we've put forward. They are threefold: housing, transportation, and neighborhood investment. That neighborhood investment piece, I think, is really critical because a lot of the dollars that would be approved in the issuance of these bonds, which I will certainly be supporting and will hope that others will, as they have in the past, a lot of those dollars will be deployed into some of the corridors where we have faced some of the most significant community safety challenges. And I think I referenced something earlier as sort of a long-term strategy. And some of these investments are long-term strategies. We have to have near-term and long-term strategies as we look to address violence and improve community safety throughout our city. These bonds will go a long way. And so I know that on a ballot that has so much attention paid to the president and the U.S. Senate and the governor and everything else, it will take a long time to work your way all the way down to the bonds. But I hope that our citizens will, and I hope that as they've done in the past, they'll continue to support those and pass those and make sure that we can invest in some of our communities that historically have not been invested in. So, Mr. Vice Chair.
So, Mr. Chair, not on that topic, but for preparation for October 26th successful council meeting. So I was looking at some of these comments, and I think one thing might be helpful is somehow we show the list of all the recommendations made. I think those in the public get bits and pieces for different groups, so somehow we can articulate that in the true sense of being transparency. I think it would be helpful. And the only thing I'm going to say to the CIG members, please sign up to speak. It's one thing for this body to vote. It's another thing to have your voice, who have worked extremely hard, to show that passion, to give us feedback. So I hope you will sign up to speak on October 26th. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Would you like to make the Mitchell motion?
Let's do it. I make a motion, we adjourn.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes, sir, Mr. Winston.
Can I just follow up on Mr. Mitchell makes a great point about speaking and going on record. I would also say that if the public forum somehow fills up, you are able to speak to specific agenda items. So if the public forum is not available on the 26th, go ahead and sign up to speak to those specific agenda items.
It is a specific agenda item, I believe, as opposed to a public forum format.
Well, I know a lot of people out there, they only look to sign up to speak towards the public forum. There's not always widespread know that you can speak to specific agenda items.
Yeah, which would be the proper method to address feedback on these issues for that on the 26th. So yes, we would love to see as many of our CIG members and as many of our community members as possible. Thank you, Mr. Winston. Mr. Winston, would you like to, well, you're not, I'm sorry. You can't second the Mitchell motion. But would one of our other committee members like to second Mr. Mitchell's motion?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much as always for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.